Thanks for joining us on this Church Project podcast. Church Project is a church. We're a gathering of people who love Jesus and want to know and love Him more, and we love each other, and we love the mission of Jesus in this world. We want to live that out together. We're a church, and we're a project. We're an ongoing pursuit to discover what Christ originally intended for church to be. So we gather on Sundays as the early church did. We listen to teaching from the scriptures. We worship together and we pray together. The early church also met house to house throughout the week and lived in community together. So we do that as well in house churches all throughout our community. And then the early church lived out the mission of Jesus, doing good works in the name of Christ and sharing the gospel. So that's Church Project. We hope that you will find a church that preaches the gospel, that teaches the truths of scriptures, that lives out the life of Jesus together in community. Check us out online as well at churchproject.org.
I'm so thankful you got a place where you can just sit in the presence of the Lord. Thank you for being here. My name is Dave Edwards. Everyone say hi, Dave.
Hi, Dave.
And I'm the pastor of discipleship here, and so I'm so glad to get to be a part of this. I'm so overwhelmed at how much incredible stuff that God's doing through our ministries, both local and global, and how He's sending out people, and the influence of the ministry of Jesus is being felt all around the globe because of what's happening here. So thank you for being part of it. Thank you for being here. Our pastor, Jason, is out today. He is attending a wedding of a lifelong ministry colleague, and so he'll be back next week. We'll pick up our study in Mark, and we're going to look at something different today. I've been loving this study in Mark. I'm just curious, by show of hands, how many of you guys own cell phones? How many of you guys own, by show of hands? Okay, if you own a cell phone, you need to download our church app. We have an app called Church Project, and on it is all the information about everything that's happening in the church, and there are daily devotionals based on what we're studying, the book of Mark, right? And so make sure and download it, not right now, but make sure and download it when we get done, and it really is, it will connect you to the life of our church and all that's going on, and the devos are there for you to kind of dial into. And David Pham spent a year designing that app, and so could we just say thank you to David Pham for his ministry. That is not an easy thing to do, and I really respect it because I'm not a tech guy at all. I have a computer, but it's old, it's wooden, and it's an Abacus with a modem. And so, but I also, now this morning, if you got a notepad or a notebook or something to write with, I'm going to ask you to write a few things down this morning. And let me just say, if you're not used to doing that, your surveys show that we remember 10% of what we hear, we remember 90% of what we write down, and I do the same thing. So I bought a book that's dedicated to our, a notebook, a journal that's dedicated to our study in Mark, and so every Sunday I'm here and I'm taking notes and learning. And so as your discipleship pastor, I want to challenge you to buy a notebook or a spiral, or if you're into looking hip and groovy, buy a leather-bound journal and pay lots of money for it. And right, but to get something that you can write on and something to write with, because it'll help you to internalize what we're hearing, right? So I'm a note guy because it helps keep me on track. I'm a bit short attention span. Do we have anybody here that's short attention span? Anybody? But I'm just curious. That's my fan base. And so I'm not sure if I'm officially ADD. I'm ADOS, which is attention deficit. Oh, shiny. And like I could click off at any moment. So the points help keep me on track. And so make sure to download the app. And so here's what we're going to do this morning. If you got your Bible, we're going to read a few verses out of the book of Numbers. All right, not the phone book, but the book in the Bible called Numbers. If you're not sure where that's at, just go to the book of Genesis and go right, and you'll run into it. If you don't have a Bible, underneath your chair or a chair close to you is a blue Bible. It looks like this. And if you don't own a Bible, this is our gift to you to take with you. If you want to read along this morning, our text in this book is on page 101. All right, so if you're not familiar with the books of the Bible, just find page 101. It's the right-hand column, right? All the verses are in the far right-hand column. Numbers chapter 13 and chapter 14. And that's where we're going to be, all right? Now, before we get to that, I want to show you what brings us to the text this morning, because I want us to look at something that all of us are affected by, every single one of us. At some time in our life, you're going to face this thing, you're going to feel it, and you're going to have to fight it, right? It's what I call the invisible giant of the Christian life. right? It's invisible because we don't see it. It's a giant because we feel the forces of it every time it comes after us. It's the presence of this invisible giant that has created within us a lot of discontent. It's the reason why a lot of us are never happy. No matter how good things go, we always find a reason to be kind of down about it or to somehow kind of slough it off, right? It's the reason for some of us, it's the angst that we feel about Christianity comes from this giant, right? This invisible giant has the ability to fly under the radar screen of our life and go largely undetected, and at the same time wreak a lot of havoc. Right? For some of us in this room this morning, it's the presence of this giant that's the reason for why we haven't given our life to Christ. For others of us, it's the reason why we haven't really stepped over into serving. It's because every time we get close, this invisible giant meets us at that point of decision and does everything it can to push us back away from what God is doing, right? It's this invisible giant that all of us, I promise you this week, you're going to face it. At some time in your life, you're going to feel the presence of it. It may be in different circumstances, but you're going to have to fight it, right? Every one of us are going to have to know how to defeat this invisible giant. And you want to know what it is? You want to know what it is? You want to know? Okay, I'm not going to tell you. And let's pray. No, it is the invisible giant of comparison. Comparison. Now, if you're taking notes, let me give you a working definition for comparison. Comparison is anytime we try to gauge our happiness or our success based on an external standard, right? Anytime we take our life and hold it up against somebody else's life, or we take our stuff and hold it up against someone else's stuff to decide whether we should be happy and pleased about where we are. That is comparison, right? Comparison is what gives birth to discontent, right? And so we have to know in our life how to spot this invisible giant, right? We have to know why it's there and then what to do to defeat it. And this is what brings us to our text this morning, because Numbers chapter 13 and 14 is about the invisible giant of comparison, right? Now, let me give you a little backstory. God goes to great lengths to liberate Israel from the evil grips of Pharaoh, right? He gets them out of Egypt, right? He gets them up to the edge of the promised land. They're now at this place camped at Kadesh Barnea, and their next big assignment is to cross the Jordan and to take the promised land, right? So the tension in the text is, right, we all wait to see if the generation or the next generation is going to have enough courage to step into the promised land, to step over into what God has for them. Right? And so what happens in Exodus, right? Numbers is a journal of that. So when you look at all these big exploits in Exodus about the travels of Israel and them crossing the Red Sea and the Promised Land, right? The journal of that is Numbers, right? So they're gathered at the Jordan. They've now taken a census. They've counted all the men, which is where the phrase, the book of Numbers, comes from, right? So they've taken a census of all the men that are fit for the fight, that they think are ready to go in and to take the land. And so what happens now, God says to Israel, okay, so you know I'm not making this up about the promised land. I want you to take one of a spy, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and send those spies into the promised land and see if it's not everything that I told you it was be. Now, the promised land is called the promised land because God promised it. Thank you, I'm a Bible scholar. And right, and so these 12 spies go into the promised land and they can't believe what they see. Right? It is the land of milk and honey. Right? The produce that this land yields is so massive that it takes 2 guys to carry back a single bushel of grapes. So these spies all go into the land. They give it the mad looky-loo. They come back to the camp of Israel, and this is where we pick the story up. Ready? So if you got your Bible, now look at this. This is Numbers chapter 13, verse 26. Look at this. And they brought back word from them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Right? They're like, look at this. Now look at verse 27. And they told him and said, we went to the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. They're like, look at this. This is the promised land, right? But look how the story starts to escalate. Now watch this. Verse 28, look at this. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and their cities are fortified and very large. Look at verse 31. And we were not able to go up against these people, for they were, look at this, too strong for us, right? They're starting to compare themselves to the people that are in the promised land. This is the big fight for many of us. It is the battle of comparison. Now look at this. Ready? Look at verse 33. and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. And fear breaks out into the camp. What meets Israel at the boundary line is the invisible giant of comparison. And we're all going to face it. It's going to come in different areas. It's going to come at different times, but it will be there. And in order to defeat the invisible giant of comparison, you got to know how to spot it, right? You got to know why it's there, right? And then we got to know what to do about it. So here we go. Ready? If you're a note taker, how then do we defeat the invisible giant of comparison? Number one, we have to be alert to the symptoms, right? Anytime comparison is at work in any of our lives, there are always two major symptoms. Ready? A, we always distort other people's success, right? So this is what they're doing. They walk into land and they go, they're so giant and we're so small. They have everything and we have nothing. They're starting to compare themselves, right? Anytime that giant of comparison gets into our life, this is one of the first symptoms. We start to look at other people and we decide they're richer, they're thinner, they got an easier life, they got better breaks. And what comparison does is that it feeds our minds with a lot of ideas of what we think a happy life should be, or a successful life should be, or where we should be based on our age. And then we find someone to project all those thoughts onto. And in reality, the people we compare ourselves to, we don't have any way of knowing those people's lives are any better than ourselves. It's all projection. That's the nature of comparison, is that we always distort other people's success. This is why when people compare, nobody ever compares down, right? No one ever goes, I have way too much money. Why can I have more poverty in my life, right? No one ever does that. No one ever goes, I am way too good looking. Why can I be uglier, right? No one ever compares down. No one ever goes, I have way too many friends. Why can I be hated by more people, right? We don't do that. We always compare up, right? We find somebody who's got something more or better or easier or richer. That's the nature of comparison. The symptom is that we start to distort other people's success. And the second symptom, if you're taking notes, B, is that we discount ourselves. We find a way to put ourselves down. And you see both of these emotions are in the text, right? Look at this. Ready? Watch this. Numbers 13, verse 33. Look at this. And we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Right? This is what they're doing. They're like, the land is great, but these giants, and they live behind fortified cities, and man, we just got blown out sandals, right? Man, we're officially refugees. We've left Egypt. We have no place to go. And these people, they got everything, right? And all of a sudden, right, they see themselves as they compare themselves to these giants. Well, listen, it's true that the land was filled with giants, but those giants weren't bigger than God, right? And comparison is to get us to lose perspective and forget whose we are. You see, so now here's the deal, right? This invisible giant of comparison can hit people in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different areas, right? For some people, it hits them physically, right? There's a reason why in our country the libraries are empty and the gyms are full, right? It's because we have a nation of people that are preoccupied with how they look, right? I don't know if you know it or not, but surveys show that a woman will spend 50% of her life worrying about how her hair looks. And surveys show that a man will spend 50% of his life not noticing. And right? When it comes to body image, it's a different struggle for men and women. A woman always has something she wants to change about herself, her hair, nails, or whatever. And for a woman, men and women use mirrors in a completely different way. For a woman, like if a woman stands in front of a mirror and thinks to herself, if I saw me naked in the woods, I'd shoot me and run back to the car. And, right, a man, right, no matter how hideous a man looks, will stand in front of a mirror and think to himself, I'm just one step away from going out with a supermodel. And, right, women freak out about their weight. They're freaked out about it, right? Men brag about it. The fatter a guy gets, the more he brags about it. Man is like, look at that. That's a lot of Krispy Kremes right there. That took me 8 months to get that. It didn't happen overnight, right? But for some people, right, no matter how much weight they lose or what kind of success they have health-wise, they're just never happy with it because they hold themselves up against some realistic standard that totally creates defeat in their life. See how subtle this stuff is? It hits people physically, right? It hits people professionally. I bet in a crowd this size, we got some people in the house that you're working with people that are your age, that are 2 or 3 positions ahead of you. right? And you think, how did they get the break and I didn't? How did they get the rose? They're not any better than me. How did they get that and I didn't? Right? It hits people financially. Right? Some of us in this house, you got people in your life that are your age and they're making 2 or 3 times what you're making, right? And man, you walk by their office on the way to your cubicle and think to yourself, how could someone so stupid get so far ahead in the name of Jesus? But you know what I'm saying? And you have to be Christian in your hatred. You know what I'm saying, right? But you look at it, you think, man, how did that happen for them and not me? That's the presence of the invisible giant of comparison. It hits people relationally, right? You don't have to be a prophet to figure this out, right? If you're single, right, there's all the pressure to get married, right? I mean, you know, you get it from your family, you get it from your friends, you go home on holidays, all your relatives are like, when are you going to get married? When are you going to get married? I'm like, right after I get a date, why don't you leave me alone? And, right, you know, and then you get married, and then what is it? When are you going to have kids, right? You get home, and all the parents are like, when are we going to hear the pitter-patter little feet? I'm like, right after you buy a dog. And how about you leave me alone, right? And then all of a sudden you bring kid in the world, and you're like, hey, we got a kid. And then what is it? When are you going to have another one? We got 2, you just got 1, right? Then you bring another kid in the world, right? And then pretty soon it's like, hey, our kids are growing up. When are your kids going to grow up, right? Hey, our kids have moved out. Hey, we're old. When are you going to be old? Hey, we're going to die first. And, all right, it never ends, right? It never ends. From single to married with kids, it never ends. And you got people that are not married that want to be married. You got people that are married that don't want to be married. Right? This is the nature of comparison, is that it levels its sights at some area to create insecurity. It hits people spiritually. And you better believe that comparison is alive and well and at work in the church. I see it in a lot of places I go, man. Today, all over this community, right, where people gather to worship, there's comparison happening in those houses. Right? You got 2 groups of people, basically, right? You got someone who's a new believer, and you got another person that's an insider, right? Kind of grown up in church, been around it their whole life. And comparison happens on both sides of this, right? You got someone who's a brand new believer who walks into an auditorium like this, and he watches people worship. He's like, man, these people are singing these songs, and he sees people with their hands raised. He thinks to himself, well, those people have questions, and why doesn't someone call on them? That guy has too, and right, you know. And he looks around, he thinks, man, these people are so spiritual, man. They could quote the script, quote the Bible without having to look at it, and they sing these songs, and they can pray on command. This guy thinks to himself, God, these people are so spiritual. I don't know if I could ever get to that level. And likewise, on the other side of the aisle, you got somebody that came from a family where their grandparents are Christians, their parents are Christians, they grew up with study Bibles on every coffee table of the house, Thomas Kincaid paintings on every wall, which, I'm sorry, and some are called to suffer, and you know what I'm saying, and right, and this person's been a believer their whole life, and he looks at somebody who's a new believer and thinks, man, God got a hold of that guy. Man, God brought that guy out of the darkness and into the light. Man, that guy's got a story, man. You can see God on that guy. Me, I've always just kind of grown up in church. Well, what is that? That's comparison. Because the enemy wants us to think that somehow if we all don't have the same experience spiritually, that somehow our experience isn't valid. And that's just not true. Because in a room this size this morning, all of us, man, we're either came to Christ or on our way to Christ under different circumstances. Some of you guys gave your life to Christ when you were little, right? You grew up in VBS and RAs. And some of you came to Christ in high school. Some of you came to Christ at the end of a broken marriage or at the end of an empty glass. And even this morning, everybody in this house doesn't have the same knowledge of the Lord. We don't possess the same experience because we're all in different places. But if comparison has its way, it'll make you discount your journey with the Lord because it's not like somebody else. That is the nature of comparison. You can't live in this community and not feel some of that stuff. Right? You can't walk through the marketplace and not feel comparison. Right? For some people, it's houses. Right? You get one house and someone else got a bigger house, so you got to get a bigger house. Right? If you got a family and you got a minivan that's got 11 cup holders, someone else got one's got 18. You're like, we hate our life, right? You got a kid, you're happy with the kid, right? But then one of your friends has got the cool stroller with the 3 knobby tires with the handbrake and the French logo on the side, and you're thinking, all I have is a navy blue folding one from Costco. I hate my life, right? And so, right, we end up getting on this treadmill. We try to keep up with everybody materially, keep up with everybody in terms of real estate and houses and cars and clothes, and we do whatever it takes to get ahead and to be and to keep up, and we try to keep up with the Joneses, and you know what we find out? The Joneses have refinanced, right? And you can't win. And on it goes. And I bet in a house this size, we got some type A overachievers, and you've succeeded a great deal in your life, but it's not enough for you. Because comparison continues to find a way to create discontent and dissatisfaction. And I bet we got some people in the house that you've kept Christ out of your life because you were over here and you compared yourself to somebody who's been a believer for 30 or 40 years, and you talked yourself out of it. I bet we got some people in the house, you've been a Christian for a long time and thought because you didn't have some sort of radical story that somehow your journey with the Lord wasn't all that great. And I came here this morning to tell you that's not true. And so comparison hits people in a lot of different places. Some of us, man, have grown up in families where you grew up in the shadow of a more successful brother or sister, and you felt like, man, I never got out of their shadow. And my family, they love me, but not as much as they love my older brother and sister. So comparison goes on and on and on. I have to say, this is what I've wanted to do my whole life. What I'm doing here at Church Project in terms of writing and speaking and teaching and training. I gave my life to Christ when I was 9. I came to Christ when I was 9. I was called to ministry when I was 16. At 16, I knew this is what I wanted to do, what I'm doing this morning. And I almost said no to it. And you know why? Because, man, I spent all my time comparing myself to every guest speaker that came to my church. I was out there, man, I had a dream. I wanted to teach and travel. And I would walk into my auditorium, and they'd say, today's guest speaker is so-and-so. These guys would get up, and they would have the craziest story you ever heard. Your crazy, life-altering stories. They would get up and go, I smoked tree bark, and I freebased Jell-O, and I robbed a bank, and I burned the house down. And then when I went into the 4th grade, they're like, what did he say? I'm like, that guy got his sin on early, right? And I'm out there going, what am I going to say, right? These guys had these crazy stories. They would get up and go, I was an axe murderer, and I found Jesus in prison, and now I've written a book called Ask Me About God. And you're like, is that even, can you even do that? Is that legal? And I was out in the crowd. You know what I was thinking? How's God going to use me? What's my story going to be? What am I going to say? I once smoked a Crayola, right? What's my story going to be? I once let the cap off a pen overnight. I drank milk that expired yesterday. I once read a book in bad light. I'm born to be mild, right? And I almost talked myself out of the will of God because I spent all my time comparing my call to somebody else's call. And I wonder if we got some people here this morning. Now, you're gifted, man. God's placed a call in your life. And you kind of talk yourself out of it because you thought, well, these people in these ministries out there, they're better, they're more skilled. Now you just kind of let comparison talk you out of it. Being in a house church or discipling another person, well, I don't know enough to disciple somebody. And we just talk ourselves out of it. That's the nature of comparison. See, here's what happens, right? We all have lived in an environment that has taught us that life is a race, even as kids, right? Even as students. Your students are learning that from our culture, right? It's not enough just to have A's. You've got to have a higher percentage of A's than somebody else, right? I mean, it's not enough just to excel. You've got to be in the advanced AP classes, right? You can't, right? And so we've been taught that it's all a race, that somehow we were put on a starting line and some celestial being shot a track pistol, and then we were told to get out front, and second is the first loser, and you better get out there. And we got into this race mentality. We got into it at school and college, in the corporate world. We got into it in our marriage and our family and our material possessions and what we have, and we got preoccupied with who was in front of us and who was behind us and who was beside us, and we lost sight of the fact that life is not for competing, but for completing the will of God. Because in the end, the question for a believer is not, did you make more money than anybody in your family? Did you wear the coolest clothes? Did you have a room full of shoes? Did you get past all the velvet ropes, get to dine on the top floors of office buildings downtown Houston? That won't be the question. The question we have to ask and answer at the end of our life to the Lord is, did I use my time and my talent and my treasure to fulfill the will of God? Did I say, God, thank you for making me successful. Thank you for giving me opportunities to succeed. Now I'm going to take what I have and where I am in life and whatever community I live in, and I'm going to leverage all that to fulfill your will. I'm not going to spend another day of my life trying to win some unwinnable race. But that's the nature of comparison, is to get us distracted from the will of God. Anytime comparison is at work in our life, you got to be alert to the symptoms. And there's always two major symptoms, right? We always distort other people's success and we discount ourselves, right? Then number two, if you're taking notes, right? Not only be alert to the symptoms, but number two, we have to be aware of the strategy, right? This is not coming from God, right? God's not making you and I feel like we don't measure up, right? This is coming from the enemy, right? This is, and when the enemy sets his sights on our life, our home, our marriages, there's a strategy behind it, right? So if you're taking notes, the strategy is twofold. Ready? A, to get us to distrust God. To get us to distrust God. Right? So look at this. Ready? Numbers chapter 14, right? So it's the next chapter. Write down. Now look at this. Verse 3. Right? Now look at this line. We'll read it and I'm going to explain it to you. Now look at this. Ready? Why is the Lord bringing us into the land to fall by the sword? Right? So they're complaining, right? They're comparing and they're complaining. So let me tell you what happens. Ready? These people have been in slavery for 400 years, right? Not just kind of held on lockdown or captivity. These people were tortured and tormented. Every pharaoh that ruled over them was worse than the one that had come before it, right? These people were required to do more with less material. God liberates these people through a series of plagues and miraculous supernatural signs of intervention. Right? So he issues these plagues against the house of Pharaoh, right? And finally, Pharaoh lets the Israelites go. They get out across the desert. They run up across the Red Sea. God parts the waters of the Red Sea to get them away from Pharaoh's army. Exodus 15 says, and Pharaoh's army and his choicest officers went down into the depths like a stone, right? God wipes out their enemies as they get to the other side to face the promised land. And then God says, here's where I'm going to take you. Ta-da! And their response is, God's trying to kill us. I'm sure God's like, no, you're way off. That's not even close. I just liberated you from all this slavery and all this torture and torment. I'm trying to get you to a new place. And they totally misread it. They totally misread it. This is what the invisible giant of comparison does, is it creates just enough distrust that we won't follow God. See, most of us in here this morning, we know enough to know that Jesus is the Son of God, right? We know enough to know that he lived a perfect life and died on the cross. And that cross was for every individual, for God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son. Right? We know enough to know they took him off that cross and he came back to life. He beat physical death. He beat spiritual death. We have 2,000 yeat of evidence, right? 2,000 years of history that these things that we know that Jesus really is who he said he is. He really did die on a cross. He really was resurrected. And the enemy knows that we know that. And he knows that we know too much to deny Jesus. So you know what the enemy of comparison does? The enemy of comparison creates just enough distrust in us towards God that we'll get close enough to sing some songs and close enough to take some notes, close enough to mingle in the foyer, but not quite close enough to let God take us where he wants to take us. With the enemy of comparison, there's always a line, right? We'll come right up to that line and go, listen, I'm all for God, but if I step over that line, I might ruin what God wants me to do. I'm not qualified. I'm too old. I'm too young. I'm not spiritual enough. All that stuff comes from the battle of comparison, right? I mean, you think about where Israel is, right? So what we're reading this morning is historically true, right? They were in a geographical place called Egypt. They were taken out of Egypt, and now they are camped in a place called Kadesh Barnea, that were real places, and they were going to the promised land. But this also has a spiritual meaning. So just think with me for a minute, right? Think about where they are. They're on the boundary line, right? Egypt behind them, the promised land in front of them. Now, in Scripture, the word land sometimes is about a geographical landmass, right? In terms of God saying, I'm going to take you into a land. But also in Scripture, the word land is symbolic of the will of God. So in other places in the Psalms, for instance, when it speaks of land, it's speaking of the will of God. So think about this, where they are, right? They're situated on the boundary line. The past of Egypt and captivity behind them, and the future of God's will in front of them. And the tension is, will they take the next step? God says, you've seen it, you've tasted it, you touched it. Now I'm going to get you there. I just want you to take the next step. And on that boundary line, the invisible giant is positioned to meet them. The invisible giant of comparison positions itself to create just enough distrust that we'll back away. Right? The second strategy, if you're taking notes, not only that we distrust God, but B, that we get disappointed with our opportunities. This is why it's never good enough for a lot of us. It's never good enough. The clothes aren't good enough, the place, the house, the car, the job, the place in the company, the title, not good enough. Right? Because the invisible giant of comparison is to get us to a place where no matter what happens, we're just never pleased with it. Now, I'm not talking about evaluating your career or evaluating, you have evaluation reports at work where people talk about, I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying for some of us, the overarching spirit of our life is one of comparison. Right? And the enemy goal and strategy is to get us to distrust God and to be disappointed with where we are in life. Right? So look at this. So look at their response. So look at this. Ready? Chapter 14, verse 3. Now watch this. Now let's read it again. Verse 3. Why does the Lord bring us into the land to fall by the sword? Now look at this. Look at this last line in verse 3. Would it not be better for us to remain in Egypt? Can you believe that? I mean, think about this for a minute, right? 450 years of slavery behind them, and God brings them up to the edge of the promised land, and they say, we'd rather go back there. Are you serious? Oh, they're like, at least we had an address and we had food every day. I mean, the conditions weren't great, but at least we kind of knew where we lived. This desert thing, we're not so sure about that. We're not really, I don't know. That's the strategy of the invisible giant of comparison. So here's what we do. Here's how we get caught between two lands. Ready? What the invisible giant of comparison does is to either get us to be paralyzed by the past or hypnotized by the future. And this is where people live. A lot of people live this. They live paralyzed by the past, and they think to themselves, if our family could just go back 5 years ago, we were a lot happier back then. If we could just move back to the town, the house that we grew up, we were a lot happier back then. If we could just go back to the way things used to be. As a college student, some of you know what it's like to long for high school. I wish I was in high school where someone else did my laundry, right? And you think, I was just happier back then. I wish I could just go back to that moment in time where I was happier. Some people get hypnotized by the future, and they think one day, the bonus is going to be up, and we're going to buy better stuff. We're going to get out of this place. And over there's a plateau. And on that plateau, man, there's the right neighborhood and a better car or another car or better clothes and better friends and cooler connections. And one day when we get over there, man, I'm really going to be happy. As a single adult, you're like, one day when I get married, man, I'm really going to be happy. And I'm going to get, when I get there, man, that's where all my hope is. But here's the problem. The past is over. All the past has done is to serve to get us up to this point, and we can't go back, and the future's not here yet, and only God knows what the future holds. The past is over, the future's not here yet, and where God is at work is in this moment. Where He's at work is at this moment today, right now, in your life, in your family. The comparison jacks up our perspective so much that we spend so much time looking over our shoulder or looking into the future that we miss what God's doing. We spend so much time degrading and being disappointed and discontent with where we are that we miss the work of God. I came here this morning to tell you, don't let comparisons steal the will of God from you. Don't let comparisons make you miss out on what God's doing in your life. Now, here's the deal, right? All of us deal with this. Now, I know some of you guys got skin of Teflon and nothing bothers you. You're like, I don't care how much money other people make. I don't care, right? You don't have any problem with driving by Crew at the marketplace and seeing two Bentleys parked out front, both that belong to the same guy, right? I mean, you don't care, right? I mean, you're like, it doesn't matter to me. I don't, But others of us, men are more susceptible to it, right? There's certain environments, there's certain people and situations that can trigger comparison just like that, right? Now, let me ask you a history question, just by show of hands. How many of you guys ever heard that when Jesus was growing up, he had brothers? How many of y'all ever heard that Jesus had brothers? Okay, all right, okay. Now, you can't tell me that household wasn't rampant with comparison. Could you be the brother of Jesus without becoming the bad one of the family? Really? Your brother is Jesus? Really? Can you imagine being the brother of Jesus and reenacting WWE in the living room and doing pile drivers off the sofa? And your mother, Mary, right, comes in out of the kitchen and goes, "You boys settle down. What's wrong with you two? Why can't you be more like your brother?" Because he's God? Good point. Go back to playing. And all right. Can you imagine Jesus as an elementary school student on the playground during recess? All the boys are playing who's the biggest, who's the baddest. And they're like, "My dad can beat your dad up." And Jesus is like, "Oh, yeah? My dad made your dad. How about you go sit down?" And all right. You know what I'm saying? I mean, my point is, everybody feels it. We all feel it at different times, right? Whether it's like, man, I should be at my age, I should be further along in my career. At my age, I should be in a different place, right? So what then do we do about it? Right? So we've said so far, right, you have to be alert to the symptoms. You have to be aware of the strategy. And then number 3, we have to apply the safeguards. There are some safeguards that we can set in place that will enable us to defeat this invisible giant. Right? And believe it or not, there is a psalm about comparison. So if you got your Bible and you flip over to Psalms 37, right? Psalms 37 is a psalm about comparison, all right? And it's David writing to himself about how to get over it. So, but in this psalm, there are 3 safeguards for us to put into our life that will enable us to defeat the invisible giant of comparison, whatever that may be for you. Right? Here we go. Ready? A. We have to defer the role of God to God. We have to defer the role of God to God. I once had an old preacher guy tell me, if you want to get along with God, stay off of his throne. And I thought, man, that's good advice. Because every time we compare, we're basically saying, God, listen, I don't really approve of what you're doing in my life. So if you just slide over, I'll take it from here. Right? But in all of our lives, for all of us, there has to be a moment that we get the roles right. There has to be a moment we come to in which we say to God, God, you're going to lead and I'm going to follow. Right? This is what he's talking about doing. Look at this. Ready? Look at verse 3 of Psalms 37. Look at this. Trust in the Lord. See that phrase? See that word trust? You know what that means? That means to lean the full weight of your life onto God. Right? An act of trust is an act in which we say, I'm going to take my marriage, my kids, my job, my income, my status, my standing, my club membership, with whatever that may be, and I'm going to take everything my life contains, and I'm going to lean the full weight of my life onto God. Right? That's what an act of trust is. Look at this. Ready? Trust in the Lord. See that word Lord? That means leader. That means leader. Shot caller, leader, the one who's in charge. So he says, trust in the Lord. This is how we defer the role of God to God. Ready? We take the contents of our life, right, both internal and external, and we lean the full weight of our life onto God's ability to lead. That's what it means to become a Christian. When someone gives their life to Christ, that's what happens, is they're saying, I'm going to take my life and all that it contains, and I'm going to lean my life into God's ability to lord over me, right? I'm going to trust in the Lord. I'm going to trust in God's leadership ability to get me where I need to be in life. You see it? We have to defer the role of God to God. And there may be some of us here this morning that you've been a Christian for a long, long time, but have been beset by comparison. And maybe you just got in a headspace where you're trying so hard to be everything to everybody, to have all the right stuff, to be in all the right places, that you lost sight of the lordship of Jesus in your life. And I wonder if we got some people who have been lifelong believers but have just lost sight. And maybe you need to have a moment where you say, God, I need to get the roles right. I need my heart to know, and I need you to know that I'm trusting you to lead me. I'm going to defer the role of God to you. So God, you be God, and I'm going to follow. So David says, trust in the Lord. Look at this next line. Look at it. Ready? Look at this. dwell in the land, right? Land's always symbolic for the will of God, right? What's he saying, right? I'm going to lean the whole weight of my life onto God's ability to get me where I need to be while staying in his will. I'm just going to stay in God's direction. I'm going to stay in God's heart's desire for me. I'm not going to spend my life trying to compete and compare and do all this other stuff. I'm just going to keep my life on track with God leading me and moving steadily towards what he wants for me, what he wants from me. That's what it means to dwell in the land, to stay in the will of God, right? So we have to defer the role of God to God. And then B, the second safeguard, is that we have to delight in our uniqueness. But we have to come to a point in which we say, I'm wired a certain way, right? God put me together in a certain way. That's your strengths, your weaknesses, your hopes, your dreams, your physical appearance, right? I was telling somebody at the end of the last service, I've been on a diet my whole life. I knew I was fat when I could pinch an inch on my forehead, and I finally figured out what's going to make me look thin is to wear darker colors and speak in bigger rooms, and that's what I'm doing. And so if you would all move to that back corner, I look like I have 2% body fat, right? But right, there's a point where, man, I'm doing the best I can do, and I'm trusting God with the rest. Right, there is a point that you have to come to in which we delight in our uniqueness. Look at this, ready? Look at it. Verse 5, look what this says. Verse 4, delight yourself in the Lord and commit your way to him. Right, the way that you are, the way in which you're moving. Just say, God, however I'm wired, whether I'm good at something or not so great, whether I'm tall or short or thin or otherwise, I'm just going to delight in how you put me together. I'm going to spend some time realizing where all that you've brought me from, all that you brought me out of, and all that you brought me into. Some of us are so hyper-focused on the next thing that we lose sight of how much God's delivered us from. And so I'm going to take a few moments to delight myself, God, in what you've done, what you brought me from, where you brought me to, what you kept me out of. You see it? The way you defeat the invisible giant of comparison is by deferring the role of God to God and by delighting in our uniqueness. And then C, the third safeguard, is that we have to deny our right to compare. We have to deny our right to compare, right? You have the right to compare yourself to anybody you want to, right? You can pick somebody else on the way home. You can drive past a neighborhood and go, I wish I were those people. And we all have the right to do it. But listen to me. You also have the right not to do it. You don't have to do it. So look at this, ready? There are two emphatic statements. Look at this in Psalm. Look at verse 7 and 8. They're almost identical and repeated. Look at verse 7. Do not fret, right? That's an Old Testament word for to compare, right? It means to play something over and over again. Why them and not me? How come they got the breaks? How come I'm not where they're at, right? Why do they have kids and I don't? You know, all that stuff, right? Don't fret. All right, look at this. Don't fret because of what you see. Right, look, he repeats it. Look at verse 8. Don't fret. It leads only to evil doing. Because if we compare ourselves long enough, we'll compromise to get whatever we're looking at. Right? If we keep comparing ourselves long enough to people and places and things, we'll compromise to get it. We're like, I don't care how much debt I have to go into. I'm going to get that. I don't care how much money I got. Even if it's past our budget, I want it. I'm going to get it. Right? Because we spent so much time fretting about it. Right? So he says, listen, don't compare. It leads only to evil doing. These statements open with the identical command. Look at it. Don't fret. Don't fret. That means there's a level of choice to it. That means that if we can compare, we can also not compare. You see it? I came here this morning to tell you that many of us here are right on this boundary line. We're on this boundary line with the past behind us and the will of God in front of us. And God waits for us to take the next step. And so I want to show you how you pray against the enemy of comparison. All right, so next time it happens, I want to give you a fighting chance. All right, so if you're taking notes, you may want to write this down word for word. If you're not taking notes, I hope you have a good memory and you haven't eaten too much NutraSweet, because it makes you lose your short-term memory. Because it makes you lose your short-term memory. All right, and anyway, so here we go. Ready? Here's the next time that you start to compare yourself to somebody, something, whatever. Here's how you pray. Again, here's how you pray this. Ready? Dear Jesus, no more. That's it. No more. No more. You have to say to comparison, no more. I'm not giving away one more week, one more year, one more month, one more day of my life fighting some sort of unwinnable game. No more. No more. And so the command in Psalm 37 is resilient. Don't fret, no more, no more. Right? There has to be something that goes off on the inside so she say, no more. And let me tell you why this prayer works. Because when we pray it, ladies, when you pray this prayer as God's daughter, guys, gentlemen, when you pray this prayer as God's son, and you say, God, because of who you made me to be, I say no more. No more. And all of a sudden, man, the Spirit of Jesus that lives within us starts to push back at that attack of comparison. And when you say, no more, no more, that enemy of comparison starts to loosen its grip. And then you go from going from one day without comparing, you make it to 2 days. And then pretty soon you kind of make it a week. And you're like, man, I'm slowly winning this battle. And then a week turns into 2 weeks. And you're like, man, I'm steadily, day by day, winning this thing. I'm growing stronger in the face of it. I'm not so easily taken down by this enemy of comparison. And then 2 weeks becomes 4 weeks, and you're a month on the other side of the battle. You're like, man, I'm getting stronger in the midst of it. And every time comparison comes at you, you can't try to think it through or rationalize it. You just have to say, no more, no more. I'm not giving away any more of my life to this. No more. And if you'll push back, that enemy will leave you alone. The tragedy of Israel in this story is that they let comparison win. And it cost them 40 years. They spent 40 years making an 11-day journey. And from this point on, they compared themselves like, we want a king like the other nations want, and we want to be like they spent 40 years of their life trying to be like everybody else instead of being who God called them to be. Losing this battle cost them 40 years. We don't have that. We don't have another 40 years to waste wandering around in the desert. So I came here this morning to tell you that for all of us that are on some boundary line between the past and the future of what God has for us and what He wants for us and what He wants from us, that to get past that boundary line, you're going to have to say to comparison, no more, no more. I'm not giving away any more moments of my life. I'm not going to keep myself and my family in the desert. No more.